A black man hurried into the courtroom, simply hoping to quickly resolve the unfair charge he had received a week earlier. But the biased judge didn't let it slide. She deliberately fined him $500 for being 15 minutes late, leaving the man furious. What the judge didn't know was that the man standing before her was an assistant U.S. attorney, and what he was about to say next would reveal a shocking secret. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. The morning sun had barely risen over Dallas's skyline when David Ramirez's alarm buzzed at 5:45 a.m. He wasn't supposed to be in court until 9 a.m., but 20 years of working as a federal prosecutor had taught him the value of being prepared. His modest apartment in downtown Dallas reflected his disciplined nature, with case files organized by color and date on his home office desk, and his court attire always pressed and hanging ready the night before. Today was different though. David wasn't heading to the federal courthouse where he usually commanded respect as an assistant United States attorney. Instead, he needed to handle a simple personal matter at municipal court, a disputed parking ticket that he believed was wrongly issued in a spot where the parking signs contradicted each other. He chose to dress more casually than usual, wearing a crisp white dress shirt and dark slacks. As he stood in front of his bathroom mirror, David ran his hand through his graying hair. At 42, his face showed the determination that had helped him become the first in his family to graduate from law school and secure his prestigious position at the U.S. Attorney's Office. Just a quick court appearance, he told himself, grabbing his thermos of coffee and the folder containing his carefully documented evidence, photographs, measurements, witness statements. He had prepared this case as thoroughly as any federal prosecution. His Toyota Camry, a practical choice that had served him well for 8 years, waited in the apartment parking garage. The car was reliable and unremarkable, though he sometimes noticed the assumptions people made when they saw a Latino man in an older car driving through downtown. The morning traffic moved smoothly through Dallas. David wasn't worried. He had left plenty of time to make the 9 a.m. appearance. He turned on NPR, listening to the morning news while mentally reviewing his documentation for the parking ticket dispute. The ticket had been issued in a spot where 2 signs gave contradictory information, and he had taken detailed photographs to prove it. At 8:10 a.m., his phone rang. The caller ID showed it was Cynthia Moore, the United States Attorney herself. David's heart rate quickened. A direct call from her usually meant something urgent. "David, I apologize for the early call," her voice came through the car speakers. "We have a situation with the Thompson trafficking case. The defense just filed a motion to suppress our key evidence, claims the search warrant was defective. I need your analysis immediately. This could destroy our entire case." David gripped his steering wheel tighter. The Thompson case was one of the biggest human trafficking prosecutions in Texas history, involving a network that had exploited over 50 victims, some of them minors. "Of course, ma'am. What's the timeline?" The judge scheduled an emergency hearing for this afternoon. "I'm emailing the defense motion to you now. Can you review it and get back to me within the hour?" "Yes, ma'am," David responded professionally, though his mind was already racing. He had spent months building the Thompson case, interviewing victims, gathering evidence, coordinating with multiple law enforcement agencies. Now a procedural challenge threatened everything. David managed to find a spot in a coffee shop parking lot near the courthouse. He pulled out his laptop, connected to his phone's hotspot, and began reviewing the defense's motion. The legal arguments were technical and complex, challenging the probable cause affidavit he had drafted for the search warrant. He found himself taking detailed notes, cross-referencing case law, analyzing each point with the precision that had made him one of the most respected prosecutors in the district. Time slipped away as he worked, drafting his response to each argument. When he finally looked at his watch, his stomach dropped. It was 8:55 a.m. The municipal court was still 10 minutes away, and he knew that finding parking and getting through security would take additional time. David quickly called Cynthia back, discussed his preliminary findings, and promised a complete written analysis after his court appearance. She thanked him, noting that his quick work had already identified the key weaknesses in the defense's arguments. Back in traffic, David tried to stay calm. He had never been late to court before in his entire career. It went against everything he believed in. But he also understood that his work as a federal prosecutor came with responsibilities that sometimes conflicted with personal matters. The Thompson case could affect dozens of lives, and that morning's emergency could impact the entire prosecution. He finally pulled into the municipal court parking lot at 9:12 a.m. As he hurried toward the building, his phone buzzed with a follow-up message from Cynthia, thanking him for his thorough analysis. David allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. At least the delay had served an important purpose. What he didn't know, as he rushed up the courthouse steps with his parking ticket documentation in hand, was that his slightly late arrival was about to trigger a chain of events that would expose deep-rooted prejudices in the very system he had dedicated his life to serving. Judge Eleanor Whitmore's courtroom awaited him, and this ordinary Monday morning was about to become anything but routine. Judge Eleanor Whitmore's courtroom had a reputation among Dallas attorneys, strict rules enforced without exception, and a judge who showed no mercy for what she called disrespect to the court. At 60 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun and reading glasses that hung on a chain around her neck, she carried herself with an air of authority built over 30 years on the bench. This Monday morning, she sat elevated above everyone else, her black robe pressed and perfect, watching as people filed into her courtroom for the 9 a.m. session. The municipal courtroom was already busy. 28 people sat on the wooden benches, most of them there for minor violations, parking tickets, traffic infractions, small disputes. Judge Whitmore noticed that most of the early arrivals were white professionals dressed in business attire, their paperwork organized and ready. She nodded approvingly at their punctuality. Efficiency was something she valued above almost everything else. "All rise," the bailiff called out at exactly 9 a.m. Judge Whitmore took her seat and began her routine with practiced precision, calling the first few cases quickly and efficiently. She took pride in running her courtroom like clockwork. Tardiness, in her view, was a sign of disrespect for the law itself, for the court's time, and ultimately for her authority. At 9:05 a.m., a young white woman in a business suit hurried through the door, slightly out of breath. Judge Whitmore glanced up briefly, paused for just a moment, then continued with the case she was hearing. The woman quickly took a seat and organized her papers. When her case was called 10 minutes later, the judge made no mention of her late arrival. At 9:08 a.m., an older white man entered, apologizing quietly. "Traffic, I understand," Judge Whitmore said, waving her hand dismissively. "These things happen." At 9:15 a.m., the courtroom door opened and David Ramirez entered quietly, trying not to disturb the proceedings. He moved carefully down the aisle, looking for a seat, but Judge Whitmore immediately stopped mid-sentence during another case, her eyes fixed on the Latino man who had just entered her courtroom. The change in her demeanor was instant and unmistakable. "Step forward," she commanded, her voice sharp and cutting. The other case was temporarily forgotten. The defendant she had been addressing looked confused but stepped aside. David walked to the podium, his posture straight and professional despite the hostile reception. He could feel every eye in the courtroom on him. Judge Whitmore looked down at her calendar without making eye contact. "You must be David Ramirez, scheduled for 9 a.m., she said, emphasizing the time heavily, her tone dripping with disapproval. "Do you think your time is more valuable than this court's time, Mr. Ramirez?" Before David could respond, Judge Whitmore continued, her voice growing louder with each sentence designed to make an example of him. Several people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably in their seats, having witnessed the different treatment just minutes earlier. "In this courtroom we have rules," Judge Whitmore lectured, shuffling papers on her desk while still not looking directly at David. "This isn't some casual gathering, where people can just wander in whenever they feel like it. This is a court of law, and in my courtroom we respect the schedule." She finally looked up at him, her eyes cold. "Do you understand me?" David stood calmly at the podium, his hands folded in front of him. He noticed how the judge hadn't even asked for his documentation yet, hadn't inquired about the reason for his lateness, hadn't given him any opportunity to explain. Her assumptions were written all over her face and in her tone. He could see it in the way her eyes had dismissed him the moment he walked in, the way she spoke to him as if he were inherently disrespectful. "Your Honor, if I may explain," David began, his voice steady and professional, keeping his tone respectful despite the clear bias he was experiencing. "You may not," Judge Whitmore interrupted sharply. I've heard every excuse in the book: car trouble, traffic, personal emergency, alarm didn't go off. None of that matters here, Mr. Ramirez. The time was set for 9 a.m. She picked up her gavel, as if the simple presence of it would emphasize her authority. The fact that you couldn't be bothered to arrive on time tells me everything I need to know about your respect for this court. The bailiff, Samuel Harris, an African-American man who had worked in this courtroom for 15 years, watched the scene with growing concern. He had seen this pattern before: the harsh treatment, the assumptions, the different standards applied to different people. He caught David's eye briefly, giving him a subtle look of understanding and sympathy. The other people waiting for their cases watched intently, some with their phones discreetly positioned, though court rules prohibited recording. A young law student named Emily Carter, who had arrived early to observe court proceedings for her civil rights class, sat forward in her seat, taking notes. This was exactly the kind of real-world injustice her professors had discussed, but seeing it unfold in person was shocking. This court will not tolerate such blatant disregard for procedures, Judge Whitmore continued. Her face had grown slightly flushed, as if David's calm professional demeanor somehow challenged her authority simply by existing. Perhaps a substantial fine will help you remember the importance of punctuality and respect. She paused for effect, looking around the courtroom to ensure everyone was paying attention. Mr. Ramirez, I hereby fine you $500 for contempt of court. The amount hung in the air like a thunderclap: $500 for being 15 minutes late. The courtroom fell completely silent. Several people gasped quietly, others exchanged shocked glances. The young white woman who had arrived 5 minutes late looked down at her hands, feeling uncomfortable. The older white man who had been dismissed with a wave shifted in his seat, his face reddening slightly. David stood perfectly still at the podium, his mind quickly cataloging every detail of this interaction. His years as a prosecutor had trained him to observe everything: the judge's tone, her body language, the different treatment he had witnessed, the excessive fine compared to others. He had seen cases where people arrived 30 minutes late and received only verbal warnings, but those people, he noted, had all been white. He took a slow, deliberate breath, maintaining his composure. Furthermore, Judge Whitmore added, seemingly encouraged by David's silence, let this serve as a lesson not just to you but to everyone in this courtroom. The justice system functions on order and respect. Without punctuality, we have chaos. She lifted a document, pretending to read from it, though it was clearly just for show. This fine will be paid today before you leave this building. The court clerk, Margaret Hill, a middle-aged white woman who had worked with Judge Whitmore for 12 years, typed the fine into the computer system with hesitant fingers. Something about this situation made her deeply uncomfortable. She had been keeping private notes for years, documenting instances that troubled her, and this morning was adding significantly to her records. Just last week, a white attorney had arrived 25 minutes late, with no explanation, and received only a gentle reminder to be on time. The white woman who had arrived 5 minutes late this morning had been completely ignored. Now David Ramirez, 12 minutes late, was being fined $500 and publicly humiliated. In the gallery, Emily Carter, the law student, was writing furiously in her notebook, documenting everything: the times, the amounts, the judge's exact words, the different treatment she had witnessed. She underlined certain phrases 3 times. This was the kind of systemic bias her civil rights professors talked about, but seeing it happen in real time was both educational and infuriating. Samuel Harris, the bailiff, maintained his professional stance by the judge's bench, but his jaw tightened noticeably. In his 15 years of service, he had kept a mental record of such incidents, though he never spoke about them openly. He knew that speaking up could cost him his job, but his conscience was becoming harder to ignore with each passing year. Today's fine was extraordinarily harsh for such a minor lateness, and the contrast with how other defendants had been treated was impossible to miss. Do you understand the fine as I have explained it? Judge Whitmore asked, her tone suggesting she expected nothing but meek acceptance. David's voice, when he finally spoke, was clear and measured. Yes, Your Honor, I understand completely. Each word was carefully chosen, his tone revealing nothing of his thoughts. He had learned long ago in his career that sometimes the most powerful response was to remain calm, document everything, and wait for the right moment. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small notepad, making a brief note of the time and amount. The judge nodded, satisfied with what she interpreted as submission to her authority. She reached for the next case file on her desk, ready to move on, as if she hadn't just demonstrated exactly the kind of bias that plagued the justice system. What she failed to notice was David's careful documentation of her words, her tone, and the different treatment he had witnessed. She was completely unaware that standing before her was not just another person she could intimidate, but a federal prosecutor with the knowledge, resources, and determination to challenge systemic injustice. What she also didn't see was the quiet determination forming in the eyes of others in the courtroom. Margaret Hill, saving her detailed notes; Emily Carter, documenting everything for what she sensed would become an important case study; Samuel Harris, silently resolving that if an opportunity came to speak truth to power, he would take it. The morning sun streaming through the courtroom windows seemed to illuminate the scene like a spotlight on a stage, highlighting the injustice for all to see. The courtroom remained tense as Judge Whitmore prepared to move on to the next case, but David wasn't finished. In fact, he was just getting started. The next few minutes would shake the foundations of Judge Whitmore's carefully controlled world, and she didn't even see it coming. The moment David Ramirez reached into his briefcase, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted subtly. He pulled out a leather credential holder, its gold federal seal catching the morning light. Judge Whitmore had already started to call the next case, assuming their interaction was over. She was wrong, Your Honor. David's voice carried a quiet authority that made everyone pause. Before we proceed, I need to properly introduce myself for the record. He held up his credentials, the gold badge of the United States Department of Justice, clearly visible to everyone in the courtroom. I am Assistant United States Attorney David Ramirez, currently serving in the Northern District of Texas. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Judge Whitmore's face, flushed with authority just moments before, drained of color. Her hand, reaching for the next case file, froze in midair. The courtroom fell so silent that the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed suddenly loud. Margaret Hill, the court clerk, stopped typing mid-sentence, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Samuel Harris, the bailiff, couldn't help but let a small smile cross his face. He had seen many things in this courtroom, but this moment would be one he would remember for the rest of his career. And Judge Whitmore started, then stopped. For the first time that morning, she actually looked at David, really looked at him. She saw not just his race or her assumptions, but his professional demeanor, his federal credentials, the quiet confidence of someone who knew the law intimately. I apologize for my tardiness this morning, David continued, his voice steady and clear. I was delayed due to an urgent matter in a federal case, the Thompson human trafficking prosecution, which I'm certain Your Honor is familiar with from recent news coverage. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. I have written confirmation of this emergency from the United States Attorney herself, which I'm happy to provide to the court. The young white woman who had arrived late earlier sank lower in her seat, witnessing what felt like a scene from a legal drama. Emily Carter, the law student, sat up straighter, her pen moving rapidly across her notepad. This was better than any civil rights case study her professors could have assigned. The elderly white man who had been waved in late looked around uncomfortably, suddenly aware of the different standards that had been applied. Judge Whitmore's mouth opened and closed several times before she found her voice. Attorney Ramirez. She shuffled papers on her desk, suddenly looking much smaller in her elevated chair. Had I known your position, my position, David interrupted, firmly but respectfully, should not matter, Your Honor. What matters is the equal application of justice. He placed his credentials on the podium and pulled out his own notepad. I have documented several concerning patterns in this morning's proceedings, including the disparate treatment of individuals based on their perceived race and social status. The judge's face shifted from pale to slightly green. As a municipal court judge, she knew exactly how much scrutiny a federal prosecutor's complaint could bring. Her mind raced back through the morning's proceedings, suddenly seeing them through new eyes: the white woman she had waved in, the white man she had dismissed with understanding, and now this Latino federal prosecutor she had fined $500 and publicly humiliated. "Perhaps," she said quickly, "we could discuss this matter in chambers, and of course the fine is dismissed immediately." "No, Your Honor," David replied, his voice carrying the weight of every time he had faced prejudice in his career, every assumption, every slight. The story quickly spread to social media. #Justice for All Dallas va. #Whitmore Court started trending locally. People began sharing their own experiences with Judge Whitmore and other judges. Soon a clear pattern emerged. Former defendants posted about their experiences: harsh treatment for minor infractions, being interrupted or spoken to condescendingly, receiving maximum fines while watching others receive lenient treatment. The stories came from African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, and other minorities, all describing similar experiences in various courtrooms across the city. Judge Eleanor Whitmore sat in her home office that evening, watching the news coverage with growing alarm. Her phone had been ringing all afternoon: calls from the presiding judge, from the Judicial Review Board, from reporters seeking comment, even from former law school classmates expressing concern. She had served on the bench for 30 years, built a reputation for running an efficient courtroom, and now her entire career was under scrutiny. She tried to remember the morning's events to justify her actions, but when she replayed them in her mind with honest eyes, the pattern David had described became uncomfortably clear. David's office phone rang again. This time it was Roberto Gutierrez, a prominent civil rights attorney in Dallas. "We've been trying to document these patterns for years," Roberto explained, his voice urgent, "but coming from a federal prosecutor, especially one who experienced it firsthand and has the evidence, this changes everything. Would you be willing to speak at a community forum tomorrow night? We're organizing something quickly while the momentum is strong." David agreed, knowing that this moment was bigger than his personal experience. In the municipal court's filing office, clerks were already pulling records of Judge Whitmore's previous cases at the direction of the presiding judge, who had been contacted by both the Judicial Review Board and several news organizations. The staff worked quietly, but their whispers revealed their awareness of what they were uncovering. One clerk found that over the past 18 months, Latino defendants were 4 times more likely to receive maximum fines in Judge Whitmore's courtroom than white defendants for identical violations. Another discovered that African American defendants were interrupted an average of 7 times more often during their court appearances. By nightfall, national legal publications had picked up the story. "Federal Prosecutor Exposes Bias in Texas Court," read one headline. "Viral Moment Sparks Calls for Judicial Reform," read another. Social media lit up with discussions about systemic racism in the justice system, with David's experience serving as a powerful example that even educated professionals with significant credentials were not immune to prejudicial treatment. Samuel Harris received several calls from other court officers that evening, including some from other courthouses. "We all see things," he told them, but this time someone with real power saw it too, and he didn't let it slide. He thought about all the times he had watched similar scenes unfold, feeling helpless to intervene without risking his own position. Now someone had finally said what needed to be said. Late that night, David sat in his home office reviewing the hundreds of messages, emails, and voicemails he had received. Legal organizations wanted him to speak at their events. Civil rights groups asked for his help in documenting other cases. Law schools requested him to give guest lectures about standing up to systemic bias. Ordinary citizens thanked him for giving voice to experiences they had endured in silence for years. He opened his laptop and began typing a formal complaint to the Texas State Commission on Judicial Conduct. This wasn't just about one judge or one incident anymore. It had become something much bigger, a catalyst for change in a system that desperately needed it. As he worked, his phone buzzed with one more message. It was from Emily Carter, the law student. "Thank you for showing us that we can fight injustice from within the system. You've given my entire generation of lawyers hope that change is possible." David smiled, thinking about how one moment of standing up for principle had sparked something he never anticipated, a movement toward real accountability and reform in the justice system he had dedicated his life to serving. 1 week after the incident, on a cool October morning in Dallas, the Texas State Commission on Judicial Conduct launched a formal investigation into Judge Eleanor Whitmore's courtroom practices. The commission's headquarters, a modern glass building in downtown Austin, buzzed with activity as investigators gathered in the large conference room on the 8th floor. Lead investigator Linda Martinez, a veteran attorney with 25 years of experience in judicial oversight, spread dozens of files across the long conference table. Her team had been working around the clock, analyzing thousands of court records from the past 5 years. "Look at these numbers," Linda said to her team, pointing at a spreadsheet displayed on the large monitor. In traffic violation cases over the past 5 years, African American defendants in Judge Whitmore's courtroom paid an average fine of $432, while white defendants paid an average of $147 for identical violations. She scrolled down. And Latino defendants averaged $398, Asian American defendants, $212. The pattern is unmistakable. Down the hall in a small interview room, Margaret Hill sat with her personal notebook open in front of her. She had requested this meeting herself, bringing forward evidence she had been collecting for 12 years. "I started keeping these records my second month working for Judge Whitmore," she explained to the two investigators sitting across from her. "I noticed she spoke differently to people, used different tones, asked different questions depending on how they looked." She opened her notebook, showing pages filled with meticulous handwriting, dates, times, case numbers, and detailed descriptions of judicial conduct. The investigation expanded rapidly beyond just fine amounts. The team interviewed dozens of former defendants, attorneys, and court staff. James Wilson, Samuel Harris's full name, had provided a written statement detailing hundreds of incidents he had witnessed over his 15 years as bailiff. "Some days," he wrote, "I would observe how the judge interrupted defendants. I kept an informal count. African American defendants were interrupted an average of 8 times per appearance, white defendants, maybe once or twice, Latino defendants, 6 to 7 times, Asian American defendants, 3 to 4 times. The pattern was consistent year after year." Emily Carter had compiled her own report from that Monday morning, complete with timestamps, photographs taken discreetly with her phone, and detailed observations. She presented it to the investigators along with statements from 4 other people who had been in the courtroom that day. "I timed everything," she explained, showing her notes. "The white woman who arrived at 9:05 received no comment. The white man at 9:08 was told, 'Traffic happens, I understand.' Attorney Ramirez at 9:12 was publicly humiliated and fined $500. The disparate treatment was obvious to everyone present." Meanwhile, at the Dallas Federal Courthouse, David continued his work on the Thompson trafficking case, but his office had become an informal gathering point for people wanting to share their experiences with bias in the courts. Young attorneys brought in records of their own experiences, community activists provided documentation of complaints that had been filed but ignored for years. "We need to organize all this systematically," David told his assistant Maria, looking at the growing collection of evidence. "Every story matters, every incident counts. This is bigger than one judge or one courtroom, it's about changing the entire system." The investigation team discovered patterns that went beyond individual bias. Analysis of audio recordings from courtroom proceedings revealed that Judge Whitmore used dismissive language like "I understand these things happen," or "We've all been there," almost exclusively with white defendants, while using phrases like "This court demands respect" and "Perhaps this fine will teach you a lesson," primarily with defendants of color. Timestamp analysis showed that cases involving minority defendants were processed an average of 42% faster, suggesting less time for explanation or consideration of circumstances. Requests for payment plans were particularly telling. White defendants who requested payment plans were approved 78% of the time, Latino defendants 34%, African American defendants 29%. When character witnesses appeared for defendants, Judge Whitmore interrupted witnesses for minority defendants an average of 4 times compared to less than once for witnesses supporting white defendants. Judge Whitmore was called in for questioning multiple times, each session revealing more about her unconscious biases. When shown the statistical evidence, she appeared genuinely shocked, sitting across from investigators in a windowless conference room. "I've always tried to be fair," she said, her voice quieter than anyone had ever heard in her courtroom. "I pride myself on equal treatment. I never thought, I didn't realize." She paused, looking at the numbers displayed on the screen in front of her. "How is this possible?" Linda Martinez, the lead investigator, responded gently but firmly. "Your Honor, this is exactly how systemic bias operates. It's often unconscious, invisible to those who perpetuate it, but devastatingly clear in its impact." She showed the judge comparison videos from her courtroom, watching herself speak to different defendants. "Notice your tone, your body language, the time you allow for explanation." The judge watched, her face growing paler with each example. The investigation also uncovered something unexpected. Several other judges in the Dallas municipal court system showed similar patterns, though none as pronounced as Judge Whitmore's. What had started as an investigation into one judge's conduct had unveiled a systemic problem throughout the entire court system. Prosecutors and public defenders were interviewed, revealing that they had long noticed these patterns but had no formal mechanism to report them without seeming biased themselves or risking professional relationships. By the end of the third week, Linda Martinez and her team had compiled a comprehensive report. The document was 278 pages long, filled with statistics, testimonies, audio analysis, and detailed examination of thousands of cases. "This report doesn't just show isolated incidents of bias," Linda explained to the commission board. "It reveals a pattern of systemic discrimination that has affected thousands of lives over many years." She placed the thick report on the boardroom table, and more importantly, it demonstrates how unconscious bias can operate so quietly that even those perpetuating it may be completely unaware of their actions, while still causing measurable harm. The commission's preliminary findings were stark. Judge Eleanor Whitmore had demonstrated clear patterns of racial bias in her courtroom, resulting in disparate treatment of defendants based on race and ethnicity over at least 5 years. The bias manifested in multiple ways: tone of voice, time allowed for explanation, amounts of fines, frequency of interruptions, approval of payment plans, and general demeanor. The cumulative effect had been to create a two-tiered system of justice in her courtroom. As news of the investigation findings began to leak to the media, the pressure on Judge Whitmore intensified. Community organizations called for her immediate removal. Legal scholars wrote opinion pieces about the broader implications of the case. Bar associations debated new oversight mechanisms. The question was no longer whether bias had occurred. The evidence made that undeniable. The question now was what justice required, and how to ensure such patterns could never continue unchecked again. 3 months after David Ramirez walked into her courtroom, the face of justice in Dallas had begun to change dramatically. The morning sun shone through the windows of the main courthouse as workers installed new signage, Center for Judicial Excellence and Equality Training. The building itself seemed to reflect the transformation happening within its walls. Judge Eleanor Whitmore was no longer on the bench. After weeks of investigation, hearings, and mounting public pressure, she had been given a choice: resign and participate in reform efforts, or face public disciplinary hearings that would end her career in disgrace. She chose resignation, but what happened next surprised everyone, including David Ramirez. In an unexpected turn of events, she volunteered to become part of the solution. "I never saw my own bias," Judge Whitmore told a room full of judges and court staff during the first mandatory implicit bias training session. She stood at a podium in the courthouse's largest conference room, looking completely different from the authoritative figure who had once commanded courtroom attention. "I genuinely believed I was treating everyone fairly, that I was just enforcing rules consistently. But the data, the evidence, it showed me something I couldn't see myself: how my unconscious assumptions affected real people's lives in real measurable ways." She paused, her voice cracking slightly. "I caused harm to people who came to my courtroom seeking justice, and I didn't even know I was doing it." David sat in the back row of the training room, watching this transformation with complex emotions. He hadn't expected this outcome when he stood up in that courtroom 90 days ago. Next to him sat Margaret Hill, who had been promoted to head the new court monitoring and accountability program. Her 12 years of meticulous record-keeping had proven invaluable in documenting patterns and designing reform measures. The changes extended far beyond one courthouse. Judge Whitmore herself sat in the back corner of the room. She had asked David privately if she could attend, and he had agreed, uncertain how the community would react. When the time came for questions, she raised her hand slowly. People turned to look at her, many with anger in their eyes. "I know many of you don't want to hear from me," she said, standing up, her voice barely audible. "I know I've caused harm that can't be fully repaired, but I want you to know that I'm committed to spending the rest of my career helping to fix what I was part of breaking." There was silence in the room for a long moment. Then Carlos Mendoza, the elderly man who had returned to the courthouse that morning, stood up. "I've been angry for 40 years, he said slowly, "about how I was treated in courts, about how my children were treated, about how my neighbors were treated." He looked at Judge Whitmore. "If you're serious about change, if you're really going to help make this right, then I'm willing to let you try." The room remained quiet, but several people nodded. The forum continued for another 2 hours, with people sharing ideas for additional reforms, having community members serve as court observers, documenting proceedings in real time, creating a mentorship program pairing experienced minority attorneys with law students, mandatory Spanish language interpreters in all courtrooms, not just when specifically requested. David's assistant Maria took notes on everything. As the meeting concluded, Emily Carter approached the microphone one final time. "I'm a second-year law student," she told the crowd. "I came to Judge Whitmore's courtroom that Monday to observe for a class assignment on civil rights. I expected to take some notes, see how courts really work, maybe write a paper." She smiled slightly. "I got more than I expected. That morning showed me that the law on paper and justice in practice aren't always the same thing, but it also showed me that change is possible." She looked directly at David. "You could have just paid the fine and walked away, used your credentials to make your personal problem disappear. Instead you made it about everyone. You documented the pattern, demanded accountability, turned a personal injustice into a catalyst for systemic change." She held up a stack of papers. "I've started a petition signed by over 2,000 law students across Texas, asking for mandatory bias training to be added to our curriculum before we're allowed to practice law, because we don't want to perpetuate these patterns. We want to be the generation that ends them." The applause was deafening. David felt the weight of responsibility but also hope, genuine hope that maybe the system could change, that maybe justice could become more than just a word carved above courthouse doors. 6 months after that Monday morning in Judge Whitmore's courtroom, the Texas legislature passed the Judicial Accountability and Equity Act, requiring all courts across the state to implement the reforms that had started in Dallas. The bill signing ceremony took place in the state capitol, with David, Margaret, Samuel and Emily all in attendance. Governor Richards spoke about how one moment of courage had sparked a movement that would affect millions of Texans for generations to come. But the real measure of change wasn't in ceremonies or legislation, it was in the small moments happening every day in courtrooms across Texas. A young Latino man arriving late to court because of a family emergency being asked with genuine concern if everything was okay, instead of being immediately fined. An African American woman being given the same amount of time to explain her situation as the white defendant before her had received. An immigrant family being provided a translator without having to specifically request one, being treated with the same respect afforded to everyone else. In her new role as director of the court monitoring program, Margaret Hill reviewed weekly reports from observer volunteers stationed in courtrooms across Dallas. The data showed measurable change. Average fines for minority defendants had dropped by 42%, not because people were being let off easy, but because white defendants weren't being given preferential treatment anymore. The standards had equalized, complaints about disrespectful treatment had decreased by 68%, time allocated per case had equalized across all demographic groups. Samuel Harris trained his 50th class of court officers and bailiffs, teaching them how to recognize bias, how to document it, how to speak up when they saw injustice. Several officers from other cities had reached out to him, wanting to implement similar training programs. He had become a national expert on court equity, receiving invitations to speak across the country. Emily Carter's legal clinic had grown to include 20 law student volunteers. They had helped over 200 people challenge potentially discriminatory treatment in courts, recovered over $150,000 in excessive fines, and documented dozens of cases that led to additional reforms. Her civil rights professor had told her that her thesis on systemic bias in municipal courts was the best student work he had read in his 30-year career. Judge Whitmore continued her work training other judges in recognizing and combating implicit bias. It was humbling work, often painful as she confronted the harm she had caused, but she persisted, determined to make whatever amends were possible. Some people would never forgive her, and she understood that, but others appreciated her honesty and her genuine commitment to change. One afternoon, a former defendant approached her after a training session. "I was in your courtroom 4 years ago," the woman said. "You fined me $600 for being late to court. I was late because I was visiting my mother in the hospital. She was dying." Judge Whitmore's eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly. "I'm so very sorry." The woman nodded. "I know you are, and I see you're trying to help fix this, so I forgive you, but don't forget, the harm was real. It mattered. It still matters." "I won't," Judge Whitmore promised. "I won't ever forget." David accepted the position chairing the Texas Commission on Judicial Equity and Accountability. It meant reducing his caseload as a federal prosecutor, but he knew this work was important. The Thompson trafficking case had resulted in successful convictions, but this work had the potential to affect millions of lives, ensuring that justice was truly equal under the law. His office was filled with charts, graphs, reports, photographs of ordinary people whose lives had been changed by simple fairness. 1 year to the day after walking into Judge Whitmore's courtroom, David returned to the same building for a ceremony. The municipal court system was unveiling a new installation in the main lobby, a wall of glass panels etched with the words of people who had experienced the court system before and after the reforms. On one panel, Rosa Hernandez's words appeared. "I used to fear coming to court, now I believe I might be treated fairly." On another, Carlos Mendoza's statement, "I've waited 40 years to feel like justice could include people who look like me." The centerpiece of the installation was a bronze plaque with words that David had suggested: "Justice is not just about the law, it's about how we treat each person who walks through these doors." Below it was the date, that Monday morning 1 year ago, and a simple line: "Sometimes change begins with one person willing to say this isn't right." As David stood looking at the installation, an older African-American woman approached him. "Excuse me, are you David Ramirez?" she asked. He nodded. "Yes ma'am, I am." She smiled. "I was in that courtroom that morning," she said. "I had a parking ticket too. I watched everything that happened. I was so inspired by what you did, but I've always wondered, why did you do it? You could have just paid the fine, moved on, used your position to make it go away. Why did you make it public?" David thought for a moment about his answer. "Because it wasn't just about me," he said finally. "Every time we let injustice slide, because it's easier, because we can afford to pay the fine, because we don't want to make waves, we're allowing that injustice to continue for the next person and the next person. And maybe those people don't have the resources or credentials or platform to fight back." He paused. "We all have a responsibility to speak up when we see something wrong, not just for ourselves but for everyone who comes after us." The woman nodded, tears in her eyes. "My son has to go to court next week for a traffic ticket," she said. "For the first time in my life, I'm not terrified about what might happen to him there. That's because of you." She squeezed his hand. "Thank you for not just moving on." As David drove home that evening, he thought about how much had changed, and how much still needed to change. The reforms in Texas were significant, but similar patterns existed in courts across America. The work was far from over, but for the first time in his career he truly believed that systemic change was possible, not easy, not quick, but possible. His phone buzzed with a text from Emily. It was a photo of her law school graduation announcement with a note: "Guess who's starting at the Civil Rights Division of the DOJ this fall? Thanks for showing me what's possible." David smiled, saving the photo. This was how change happened, not just through laws and policies, but through inspiring the next generation to care about justice, to fight for it, to refuse to accept that inequality was just how things were. The sun was setting over Dallas, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold as David pulled into his apartment parking lot. He thought about that Monday morning 1 year ago, how he had worried about being 12 minutes late to court, how he had expected a simple interaction and a quick resolution, how one moment of deciding to document the bias rather than just accepting it had changed so many lives. He pulled out his wallet and looked at the copy of the $500 receipt he kept there, a reminder that sometimes the cost of speaking up seems high, but the cost of staying silent is always higher. Sometimes justice requires us to stand up even when it's uncomfortable, even when we could walk away, even when it might be easier to just pay the fine and move on, because justice isn't just about our own convenience. It's about creating a system that treats everyone with equal dignity and respect. David walked into his apartment, set down his briefcase and looked at the framed photograph on his wall, the bronze plaque from the courthouse, the faces of Margaret, Samuel, Emily, Rosa, Carlos, and dozens of others who had found their voices and demanded change. This was what justice looked like, not just laws and courtrooms, but people, ordinary people, deciding that enough was enough and refusing to stay silent. 1 year ago, he had walked into a courtroom expecting a simple transaction. Instead, he had sparked a movement and discovered that sometimes the smallest acts of courage can create the biggest changes in the world. Tomorrow he would continue the work. There were more courts to reform, more patterns to document, more people to train, but tonight he allowed himself a moment to appreciate how far they had all come, how many lives had been changed, how much more equal justice had become, and how much hope there was for the future. 5 years had passed since that Monday morning, and David Ramirez stood once again in a courtroom, but this time it was the Supreme Court of the United States in Washington, D.C. The marble columns rose majestically around him as he waited to present oral arguments in Martinez, State of Texas, a case challenging systematic bias in municipal court systems nationwide. The case had originated from the reforms in Dallas and now carried the potential to transform justice across America. Sitting in the gallery were faces he knew well: Margaret Hill, now serving as the national director of the Court Equity Project; Emily Carter, who had clerked for a federal appeals court judge and was now arguing civil rights cases across the country; Samuel Harris, who had trained over 5,000 court officers in 42 states; Rosa Hernandez, whose story had become part of the legal brief demonstrating real-world harm from biased systems; and Carlos Mendoza, now 76 years old, who had insisted on making the journey to witness this moment. Judge Eleanor Whitmore watched from her home in Dallas, the live broadcast on her television. She had spent the past 5 years as a consultant, helping courts nationwide recognize and eliminate bias. Her book Blind Justice: How Unconscious Bias Nearly Destroyed My Career and How We Can Fix the System had become required reading in law schools across the country. She still carried the weight of her past mistakes, but had channeled that burden into meaningful action that had helped transform hundreds of courtrooms. The reforms that began with one $500 parking ticket had spread far beyond Texas. 38 states had adopted similar accountability measures. The American Bar Association had made implicit bias training mandatory for all attorneys. Federal courts had implemented demographic tracking systems. Law schools had redesigned their curricula to emphasize equity and justice over mere legal technicality. But David knew the work was far from complete. As he stood to address the 9 justices, he thought about all the people still facing bias in courtrooms: the single mothers struggling with excessive fines, the immigrants treated with suspicion, the young black men presumed guilty, the countless individuals who never had a platform to challenge injustice. This case was for them. Your Honors, David began, his voice steady and clear. This case is about a simple principle: equal justice under law, not just as an ideal carved in stone above courthouse doors, but as a lived reality for every person who seeks justice in our courts. The data from Texas and 37 other states demonstrates that when we measure our systems, we find disparities that shock the conscience, and when we implement accountability, transparency, and training, we see measurable improvement. He spoke for 30 minutes, presenting evidence, statistical analysis, testimony from thousands of defendants. The justices asked pointed questions, challenged his arguments, probed the implications of his proposed remedies. When he finished, David felt the weight of responsibility, but also the strength of knowing that millions of people stood behind him, not just those in the courtroom, but everyone who had ever experienced injustice and dared to hope for change. That evening, as David walked past the Lincoln Memorial, he received a call from Emily. Did you see the response? She asked excitedly. Social media is exploding with people sharing their court experiences. #equal-justice #real justice is trending in 70 countries. Law students are organizing watch parties. Legal aid societies are preparing to file similar cases in their states. David, you did it. You actually changed the conversation. We did it. David corrected gently. All of us. Everyone who refused to stay silent. Everyone who documented their experiences. Everyone who believed the system could be better. I just stood up in a courtroom 5 years ago. Everything that followed came from ordinary people deciding they deserved equal treatment. 6 months later, the Supreme Court issued its decision. In an 8-1 ruling, the court held that systematic disparate treatment in municipal courts violated the Equal Protection Clause and required states to implement monitoring, training and accountability measures. The opinion cited the Texas reforms as a model, noting that justice often requires not just good intentions, but rigorous self-examination and measurable accountability. David read the opinion in his office, surrounded by his team. They had won a complete victory that would affect millions of lives, but as he looked at the faces around him, Margaret, Samuel, Emily, Roberto, Linda, and so many others who had contributed to this movement, he knew that the real victory wasn't in the court's ruling, it was in the transformation of consciousness, the shift from accepting bias as inevitable to demanding better from their institutions. That weekend, David returned to Dallas, to the municipal courthouse where it had all begun. The building looked different now, bright, welcoming, with signs in multiple languages explaining rights and procedures. Community volunteers staffed help desks. Court observers documented every proceeding. Demographic data was posted publicly, showing continued progress toward equity. He walked into the courtroom where he had been fined 5 years ago. It had been renamed the Equal Justice Courtroom and served as a training center for judges from across the country. A new judge was being sworn in, a young Latina woman named Maria Santos, who had written her law review article on the Ramirez case and dedicated her career to ensuring equal access to justice. After the ceremony, Maria approached David. I read about what happened here, she said. This courtroom, this moment, it changed my life. I was a college student working 2 jobs, barely getting by. I had a traffic ticket, and I was terrified of going to court because I'd heard stories about how people like me were treated. She paused, but then your case happened, and suddenly people were talking about fairness, about change, about how the system could be different. I decided to go to law school because I wanted to be part of that change. David smiled. That's the real legacy, he said, not one case or one ruling, but inspiring people to believe they can make a difference, and then watching them actually do it. You're going to make this courtroom a place where everyone feels justice is possible.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.